Sure. Well, thank you, JC, and we're going to begin this panel on China competition. And since it is China competition, I thought we'd start off by citing Confucius. Now, Confucius has this idea of zhenming, the rectification of names, and that essentially means that you should call things by their proper name, because if the names are not correct, then language will not accord with reality. In other words, if you buy the premise, then you buy the conclusion, and if the premise is incorrect, the conclusion will be incorrect. So I think the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we mean by China competition? What are the underlying premises here? Now, one approach was voiced by Secretary Blinken in March of 2022 at a speech at George Washington University, where he said the Biden's administration strategy can be summed up in 3 words: invest, align, compete. And he summed up and said, to the People's Republic of China, we'll compete with confidence, we'll cooperate wherever we can, and we'll contest where we must. We do not see conflict. Now, unpacking that statement really, I think, emphasizes cooperation on issues such as climate, okay? And it views competition mostly in economic terms, if you read the context of the speech. And that closing, however, we do not see conflict, speaks volumes, and I'll leave it to you to unpack, I guess, what is being spoken. Others identify China as a strategic competitor. There was a RAND publication from June of 2021 that spoke of the PRC as a near-peer great power, and the United States has the upper hand in a comprehensive national power, but China is narrowing the gap. Well, that's, I think, a little bit better. I think it accords a little bit more closely with the reality, but it also recapped a number of RAND studies that I think are a little bit off the mark. One of them says, whether a growing competition for influence and leadership with the United States in shaping the terms of the international order escalates into dynamics that become destructive of that order remains to be determined. Further, RAND also saw strategic competition in economic terms primarily. It's geoeconomics rather than geopolitics in which the contest for world leadership will play out. The principal Chinese challenge is not that it'll impose authoritarian governments on its trading partners, but that over time, it will skew global standards for trade and investment in its favor to the disadvantage of competitors. This, too, I think, misses the true nature of the competition. I think a better approach was last year the German government, which identified the PRC as a systemic competitor that was intent on displacing the entire post-war rules-based international order with one of its own devising. I think that was very clear-eyed. However, what the German position paper gave with one hand, it took away with the other, because the other part of it is, well, we have to trade more with China because our economic circumstances warrant it. And I think that really is schizophrenic. It really is the idea then, and you see companies like BASF, Volkswagen that have invested heavily in China and also are complicit in some of the forced labor human rights abuses there. If you look at what has happened to companies, most famously Nortel. Nortel entered the China market back in the 1990s with great visions of reaping tremendous profits in the China market. But they entered into, I think, a joint venture agreement with what became Huawei. They were devoured. They were eaten. There is no more Nortel. And I think the same thing as you could say with American companies too. Apple's heavily invested, Tesla, Microsoft, which has outsourced its research and development. I mean, this idea that you can engage in trade with a predatory mercantilist command economy that's able to devote resources not just to particular sectors of the economy, but to particular companies. and that would steal intellectual property from its joint venture partners, only to devour them later, and also uses forced labor, slave labor, to undercut prices. Well, that makes no sense. Miles Yu Mao-chun, has made that point. How do you include such a regime within a World Trade Organization, for example? So where does that leave us? First of all, I think when we talk about China competition, it's important to get the premise right. It is not competition with China, really, but rather the Chinese Communist Party, and that's an important distinction to make. Okay, we have to separate the party from the people of China. And we need to understand the nature of that regime. And an important point, because we missed this before. 1989, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, George H.W. Bush sent Brent Scowcroft to Beijing, all at in the interest of stability. So which conception then is correct? I think the Germans, when they referred to, I wouldn't say China, but the CCP as a systemic rival, the Germans are right. They are a systemic rival here. They do seek to upend the whole rules-based international order. Now, history here, I think, is useful to understanding it. We have certain themes that weave in and out over time. The desire really is one of hegemony, to rule all under heaven, Tian Sha. And if you look back in Chinese history during the Warring States period, the state of Qin, which would become dominant among these states, it was governed by a philosophy known as legalism, which essentially is a proto-totalitarian theory. And if you want to look at continuity through Chinese history, start with legalism. Is the current regime truly a communist regime, or is it a Chinese legalist regime onto which Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Shiism have been grafted onto? And if you want to look at a very important theoretician there within the Communist Party hierarchy, I would point you to Wang Huning. Wang Huning, who studied in the United States, wrote a book called America Against America. He advised, starting with Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping. He's had tremendous survivability. You read about all these purges that are taking place. He's a survivor. And in some ways, he's also powerful enough to be a critic of Marxism, Leninism, almost from a legalist perspective. So keep in mind these patterns of thought there that continue. Now, the Qin dynasty, the first regime to unify China, we get the name China from that, it began with the conquest of a sort of a rump kingdom that had a hereditary sense of privilege. The state of Zhou, they had these 9 cauldrons, and if you get the 9 cauldrons, you get legitimacy. In many ways, the state of Zhou is like Taiwan. Taiwan, as long as it exists as a Republic of China, it challenges that claim to legitimacy. William Lai Ching-te, the Taiwan president, spoke about that during the Double 10 National Day for the Republic of China, Taiwan, where he spoke about the fact that the Republic is antecedent to the People's Republic. So, so it maintains this challenge of legitimacy, which I think is why Taiwan is so much of a target right now. But then you had these 6 remaining warring states. What did the Qin dynasty do? They used wolf warrior aggression. They co-opted elites. They had a 1,000 talent program. Interestingly, one of their main talents that they couldn't get was a theoretician named Han Feize. He was the great legalist thinker. He was probably the preeminent theoretician that was the basis of their legalist philosophy, but he remained loyal to the state of Han. He was suicided in prison, in a Qin prison. But most importantly, what the Qin dynasty did is that they set standards. And this, I think, is something that is missed and is absolutely key. So that's where the Chinese language, the written language, became unified. Weights and measures became unified, standardized on Qin terms. The ruts in a road, so you can drive carts through. If you know the Chinese character for cart or for a car, it's a cart, and the ruts in the road were standardized so that everyone could travel, all over the place. So this standardization, is critical. Today we see the same tactics. the wolf warrior aggressive approach, whether it's what I like to call the West Philippine Sea, unless I'm talking to the Vietnamese, it's the East Vietnam Sea. Why do we call it the South China Sea? You know, we're just really affirming that. In Chinese, they don't even call it the South China Sea, they call it the South Sea. So maybe we can rectify our own language and get those terms correct. They also, they have their 1,000 Talents programs, but we also see the setting of standards, and this is really important, because who sets the standards for the global world order really calls the shots. And that's why it could be something like technology with 5G, where China is seeking to set the standard. You can see it as the attack on the dollar as the reserve currency. We see it now emerging with the BRICS, the idea of the petro-yuan, this trade with Saudi Arabia, that challenges the petrodollar. You're seeing counter-trade. You're also seeing an appeal to, for example, African nations. You can avoid sanctions and the Western sanction regime if you just don't trade in dollars. You also see it with regards to, I think, global human rights standards. And if you saw the Universal Periodic Review last January, where China really challenged and pushed back and its allies, the countries that lined up with China and against China was basically 50-50. They want to reframe human rights not so much as individual rights or what we call negative rights, rights that are held against the state, but rather collective rights, a right to development. They speak about a shared common destiny of mankind. So this is a reordering of that international order. A very important document to understand where China is going was what's referred to as document number 9, or more formally, it was the communique on the current state of the ideological sphere. It was a 2013 document. It basically parallels Xi Jinping's accession. And one of the things that they attacked was the notion of universal values that they equated with Western values. In other words, values that transcend nation and class, that appeal to all humanity. They call those Western values, and they said they were antithetical to Chinese values. A little bit like Lee Kuan Yew's, if you remember, the Asian values debate from the 1980s and 1990s. This is, though, absolutely false, and don't really have time to go into it here. I've spoken and written about it elsewhere. But there is a counter-tradition to that, a Confucian tradition that's proto-democratic, that's compatible with human rights. The language that's used is not our modern human rights language. And if you look at the founding of the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, P.C. Chang, Zhang Bengjun was one of the draftsmen of it, and that, you know, was a contribution. So that notion is false. So just to leave you then with a question. What is to be done? Here we're citing Vladimir Lenin. You know, it's terrible, but he wasn't the only person to ask the question. What can we do? Well, we're not here about regime change. Any change within China has to come from the Chinese people themselves. And, you know, right now it's a very unstable situation. Xi Jinping, these purges, it's unclear if it's Xi who's purging or enemies of Xi Jinping who are purging. We should stop making a fetish of stability. Like I said, that mistake that George H.W. Bush made in sending Brent Scowcroft after Tiananmen, that great thing. There right now, you're seeing a lot of centripetal and centrifugal forces. Xi Jinping consolidating his control of the last party Congress for an unprecedented third term in the modern era. Yet at the same time, you see these centrifugal forces, the white paper movement and the like. It's important that the West stop subsidizing tyranny, whether it's the U.S. government with for example, our fish purchases, our U.S. Department of Defense and Department of Agriculture for our military bases and our school lunch programs and our prisons, federal prisons, purchases fish that's tainted with forced labor, both in the fishing, the deep sea fishing, and also in the fish processing. We're violating at least 3 U.S. laws I can name off the bat in the process. And U.S. companies have to stop subsidizing tyranny, relying on forced labor. One thing I hope that the incoming administration would do, we just saw a SEC nominee, use the Securities and Exchange Commission, Rule 10b-5 that governs, you know, not just material misstatements, but material omissions. If you fail to disclose that you have forced labor in your supply chain, that should be a violation. So we need a more active SEC there in policing our own corporate behavior. And look, there's I just want to close with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, one of the famous works of Chinese literature. It's a historical work of historical fiction. It begins with this saying, the realm long divided must unite, long united must divide. I think what we're seeing in China now, again, the centripetal and centrifugal forces, if the centrifugal forces are ascendant, if the Chinese people are ascendant against their government, well, let it fall apart. Thank you very much.